They sent her an invitation to the 10-year reunion, not because they wanted to see her, but because they wanted to humiliate her one last time. The girl they called the class loser. The one they mocked, ignored, and wrote off as invisible. They laughed as they added her name to the guest list, already imagining her walking in alone, out of place, embarrassed. But when the night arrived and the ground began to shake, no one was laughing anymore. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories of quiet strength and unexpected triumph, consider subscribing. What happened next would leave 200 people speechless. The rooftop bar overlooked downtown Seattle, like a crown perched on glass and steel. Golden hour light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the edges of wine glasses and casting long shadows across the polished table where 4 people sat. The city stretched out below them, glittering and distant, as if the world itself existed only to frame this moment. Bridger Castellan leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, his other hand scrolling through his tablet with the kind of ease that came from never having to worry about anything. He wore a tailored navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his smile was the practiced kind that came from years of closing real estate deals with handshakes and hollow charm. Beside him, Sloane Devereaux held her phone at arm's length, angling it to capture the sunset behind her. She tilted her head, lips parted just slightly, and snapped 3 photos in quick succession before lowering the device to review them. Her hair was styled in loose waves that looked effortless, but had likely taken an hour to perfect. She was the kind of person who curated her life for an audience, every moment filtered and framed, every interaction a potential post. Across from her sat Paxton Rhee, a corporate attorney whose entire presence radiated control. His suit was charcoal gray, his tie perfectly knotted, and his expression held that permanent edge of skepticism that lawyers wore like armor. He swirled his whiskey glass slowly, watching the ice shift, as if even his drink required strategic consideration. Lennox Faust completed the quartet. He was the youngest of the group, lean and sharp-featured, with the kind of restless energy that came from building a tech startup from nothing and watching it explode into something real. He checked his watch twice in the span of a minute, not because he had somewhere to be, but because his entire identity was built on the idea that time was the only currency that mattered. The 4 of them had been meeting like this for months, planning the Glenridge Academy class of 2015 reunion, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who peaked in high school and never quite moved on. Bridger stopped scrolling and tapped the screen. A smile spread across his face, slow and deliberate, the kind that promised trouble. He turned the tablet toward the others. Wait, he said. What about Elowen? Sloane looked up from her phone, squinting at the screen. Then her eyes widened and she burst into laughter, the kind that was too loud for the space, drawing glances from nearby tables. She covered her mouth with one hand, but the laughter kept spilling out. Oh my God, she said between gasps. Elowen Ashby? I completely forgot she even existed. Paxton leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he studied the image on the tablet. The girl who ate lunch alone in the art room every single day? He asked, his tone halfway between disbelief and mockery. Are you serious right now? Lennox grinned, leaning in closer, his eyes lighting up with the kind of cruel inspiration that came from recognizing an opportunity. This is perfect, he said, tapping the table with his knuckles. We send her an invite. She shows up thinking people actually want to see her, that maybe things have changed, that maybe she matters now. Sloane picked up the thread immediately, her laughter subsiding into something sharper, more calculated. And we get to remind everyone how far we have all come, she said. The contrast alone would be, she paused, searching for the right word, then smiled, chef's kiss. Bridger was already typing, adding Elowen's name to the digital guest list with theatrical flair. To the Glenridge Academy class of 2015 reunion, he narrated aloud as he typed. At the Cascadia Grand Estate. Black tie required. He looked up, grinning. She will show up in something from a thrift store. Paxton smirked, lifting his glass. If she even shows up at all. Sloane raised her own glass, tilting it toward the others. Oh, she will, she said, her voice low and certain. People like Elowen always show up. They always hope things have changed. They clinked their glasses together, the sound sharp and bright in the warm air. The toast felt less like a celebration and more like a pact, a shared understanding that some people existed only to remind others of how much better their own lives had turned out. Bridger tapped a final button on the screen, and a notification appeared in the corner. Invitation delivered. The camera lingered on the tablet screen, zooming in slowly on the yearbook photo that accompanied Elowen's name. It was a school portrait from 10 years ago, the kind taken in a gymnasium with portable lights and a bland gray backdrop. The girl in the photo was pale, almost ghostly, with oversized glasses that seemed to swallow half her face. Her hair was thin and pulled back into a tight, unflattering ponytail. She wore a sweater that looked 2 sizes too big, drowning her already small frame. But it was her eyes that held the camera. They stared directly forward, unblinking, unreadable, as if she were looking not at the photographer, but through him, past him, into something farther away. There was no smile, no attempt to seem approachable, just that quiet, unsettling stare. The screen froze on that image, and then the scene shifted. The high school hallways appeared in fragments, quick cuts of memory that felt more like wounds than nostalgia. There was no dialogue, only images. Elowen sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, her back against the wall, a book open in front of her. The title was visible if you looked closely. Flight Dynamics and Aeronautical Engineering. Around her, tables full of students laughed and shouted and lived their lives as if she were not even there. She turned a page, her expression unchanged, her focus absolute. She had learned long ago that invisibility was safer than visibility. The next image showed her locker, spray-painted in thick, dripping letters with the word Ghost. The paint was still wet, running down the metal in uneven streaks. Elowen stood in front of it, staring at the word, her backpack hanging from one shoulder. She did not cry, she did not react. She simply opened the locker, retrieved her books, and walked away. Behind her, a group of students stood watching, Sloane among them, smirking as she whispered something to the girl beside her. They all laughed. A classroom appeared next. A teacher handed back tests, moving down the rows, placing papers face down on desks. When she reached Elowen, she paused, smiled faintly, and set the paper down with a nod. Elowen turned it over. 98%. Behind her, Bridger received his own paper. 72%. He glanced at Elowen's score over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. He crumpled the paper into a ball and threw it at the back of her head. It bounced off and landed on the floor. Elowen did not turn around. She simply folded her test neatly and placed it in her binder. The final fragment was the most painful. It was career day, held in the school gymnasium. Rows of booths lined the space, each representing a different profession or branch of the military. Students wandered from table to table, asking questions, collecting brochures, imagining futures. In the far corner, near the exit, stood a booth with a banner that read, U.S. Navy Recruitment. Behind the table sat an officer in dress whites, patient and professional, waiting for someone, anyone, to show interest. Only one person stood there, Elowen. She leaned forward slightly, asking a question the camera could not hear. The officer handed her a pamphlet, and she took it carefully, as if it were something fragile. Across the gym, a group of students pointed at her and laughed. One of them mimicked a salute, exaggerating the motion, and the others doubled over. Elowen did not look at them. She simply thanked the officer, tucked the pamphlet into her bag, and walked away. The last image was graduation day. The building stood tall and imposing, red brick and white columns, the kind of architecture meant to suggest tradition and excellence. Students poured out of the double doors in caps and gowns, surrounded by families taking photos, friends, hugging, parents crying with pride. Elowen walked out alone. No family, no friends. She wore her cap and gown, but there was no one to take her picture. She paused at the bottom of the steps, turning back to look at the building one final time. Her expression was unreadable. Then she turned and walked away, down the long sidewalk, into the distance, until she was just a small figure disappearing into the afternoon light. The camera held on the empty doorway she had left behind, the space where she had stood, as if the absence itself was louder than any goodbye. A voiceover drifted over the image, soft and detached. They wrote her off as nothing, a dreamer, a nobody. The scene shifted forward, snapping back to the present. The Cascadia Grand Estate appeared on screen, a sprawling venue of old-world elegance and new-world excess. Marble columns framed the entrance, wrapped in strings of warm Edison bulbs that glowed like fireflies in the evening air. A red carpet stretched from the valet stand to the front doors, flanked by carefully manicured hedges and topiary shaped into perfect spirals. A live jazz band played somewhere inside, the music drifting out through open windows, mingling with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Luxury cars pulled up one after another, sleek sedans and convertibles, each one more expensive than the last. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried to open doors, offering hands to guests who stepped out in designer dresses and tailored suits. Bridger, Sloane, Paxton, and Lennox stood near the entrance, positioned like hosts at a coronation. They greeted each arriving guest with wide smiles and enthusiastic hugs, the kind of shallow warmth that looked perfect in photos, but felt hollow up close. Sloane held her phone in one hand, snapping candid shots of arrivals, already planning which ones would make it to her social media feed. Bridger shook hands with a former classmate, clapping him on the shoulder and laughing at a joke that probably was not funny. Paxton accepted a champagne flute from a passing server, lifting it in a silent toast to no one in particular. Lennox checked his watch again, then glanced toward the driveway, as if waiting for something specific. Sloane leaned closer to Lennox, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She RSVP'd. Yes, she said. I checked this morning. Lennox raised an eyebrow. No +1? Sloane smiled. Of course not. Bridger checked his own watch, frowning slightly. She is late, he said. Probably could not find anything to wear. They laughed, the sound sharp and easy, and moved inside to join the party. The ballroom was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting prismatic light across the polished marble floor. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space, each one topped with elaborate floral centerpieces that smelled faintly of roses and lavender. At the far end of the room, a massive projection screen displayed a rotating slideshow of yearbook photos, prom pictures, sports victories, candid moments frozen in time. The images cycled slowly, each one accompanied by a ripple of recognition and nostalgia from the crowd. People pointed at the screen, laughing, groaning, reminiscing about hairstyles and fashion choices that had not aged well. When Elowen's yearbook photo appeared on the screen, the room erupted. Laughter echoed from every corner, loud and unrestrained. Someone near the bar shouted, "Oh my God, I forgot about her." Another voice chimed in from across the room. She was so weird. Did she not want to be a pilot or something? More laughter. Someone else added, "Yeah, good luck with that." The photo lingered on the screen for a few more seconds. That same pale face, those same oversized glasses, that same unreadable stare, and then it cycled to the next image. The laughter faded, replaced by the hum of conversation and the clink of silverware against plates. Sloane stood near the edge of the dance floor, holding her phone up to film a quick video for her followers. She smiled into the camera, her voice bright and performative. "Reunion glow-up check," she said, tilting the phone to capture the room behind her. "Let's see who shows up tonight." She winked and ended the recording, already planning the caption. Paxton stood at a table near the entrance, nursing his second whiskey of the night. He leaned toward Lennox, who had finally stopped checking his watch and was scanning the room with the detached interest of someone who had already decided the event was beneath him. $20 says she shows up in a Honda Civic, Paxton said, smirking. Lennox snorted. "I will take that bet. I am thinking she does not show at all." They shook on it, sealing the wager with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having been on the other side of the joke. Inside, the party continued. The jazz band transitioned into a swing number, and a few couples moved onto the dance floor. Servers circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The slideshow kept cycling, each photo met with cheers or groans or good-natured teasing. It was the kind of night that felt perfect on the surface, the kind of night people would post about and remember fondly, the kind of night that hid its cruelty beneath layers of nostalgia and expensive wine. And then the music stopped. It happened mid-song, the band cutting off abruptly as if someone had yanked a plug from the wall. The sudden silence was jarring, disorienting. People froze, drinks halfway to their lips, conversations trailing off into confused murmurs. a low, rhythmic sound began to fill the space, faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. The sound vibrated through the floor, rattling the glassware on the tables, making the chandeliers sway ever so slightly. Bridger frowned, looking around. What the heck is that? The sound grew louder, deeper, more insistent. Thump, thump, thump. The vibrations intensified, strong enough now that people could feel them in their chests, in their bones. A champagne flute tipped over on a nearby table, spilling pale liquid across the white linen. Someone gasped. Another person laughed nervously, unsure whether this was part of the entertainment or something else entirely. Paxton set his whiskey down, his expression shifting from amusement to concern. Is that thunder? But it was not thunder. Thunder came in bursts, in crashes. This was steady, mechanical, relentless. The sound continued to build, filling the ballroom, drowning out the murmurs and the nervous laughter. The chandeliers swayed more visibly now, their crystals clinking together in a discordant melody. A crack appeared in one of the tall windows, a hairline fracture that spread slowly outward like a spider web. Someone near the back of the room screamed. The crowd began to move, a collective surge toward the windows and the French doors that opened onto the lawn. People pushed past one another, craning their necks, trying to see what was happening outside. The sound was deafening now, a deep mechanical roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The floor shook. The walls trembled. The entire building felt as if it were holding its breath. Sloane stumbled toward the nearest window, her phone clutched in one hand, her face pale. She pressed her palm against the glass, staring out into the night. "What is happening?" she whispered, but no one answered. No one knew. The French doors flew open, blown wide by a sudden gust of wind, and the crowd spilled out onto the lawn. The camera followed them in a single, unbroken shot, weaving through the chaos, capturing the confusion and fear etched into every face. Outside, the night air was thick with dust and noise. The manicured lawn, which had been pristine just moments before, was now obscured by a swirling cloud of debris. The roar was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against eardrums and made it impossible to think, to speak, to do anything but stare. And then, through the dust, a shape began to emerge. It descended from the sky like something out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on who was watching. The AH-64 Apache attack helicopter was massive, its rotors slicing through the air with brutal precision, kicking up dirt and grass and sending it spiraling outward in waves. The landing lights blazed white-hot, illuminating the stunned faces of 200 guests who stood frozen on the lawn, mouths open, eyes wide, utterly unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The helicopter descended slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. The noise was unbearable, the wind was relentless, and yet no one moved, no one ran. They simply stood there, transfixed. The Apache touched down with a shudder, the landing gear sinking slightly into the soft earth. The rotors began to slow, the roar diminishing to a low, steady hum. The dust settled, drifting back down to the ground in lazy spirals. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was heavy, expectant, as if the entire world were holding its breath. The side door of the helicopter opened. A gloved hand gripped the edge of the doorframe. A boot touched the ground. The camera held on the silhouette, backlit by the helicopter's interior lights. A dark figure framed against the glow. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire crowd stood in frozen disbelief, staring at the figure emerging from the machine. Sloane's voice broke the silence, barely audible, trembling with disbelief. "Elowen?" The figure stepped fully into view. Elowen Ashby stood before them, and she was unrecognizable. Gone was the pale, fragile girl from the yearbook photo. In her place stood a woman forged by discipline, sacrifice, and something far beyond the reach of anyone in that crowd. She wore a full naval aviator flight suit, olive green and perfectly fitted, with patches on her shoulders that read U.S. Navy and HSC 85. A trident insignia gleamed on her chest, the symbol unmistakable. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, functional bun. Her face was calm, composed, carved by years of training and survival in environments most people could not even imagine. She removed her helmet with one smooth motion and tucked it under her arm. Her gaze swept across the crowd, steady and unwavering. She did not smile. She did not need to. Behind her, two crew members stepped out of the helicopter, both in uniform, both standing at attention. One of them, a young petty officer, saluted her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear despite the residual hum of the rotors. "We will be on standby." Elawan returned the salute with precision. "Thank you, petty officer." She began to walk forward. The crowd parted, not because anyone consciously decided to move, but because something about her presence demanded it. She walked with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she had done. Every step was measured, deliberate, unhurried. She was not here to rush. She was not here to perform. She was simply here. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, spreading like wildfire. "Wait," someone said near the front. "Is not she the one who—" Another voice picked up the thread. "The Yemen extraction." That was her crew. A third voice, frantic, already pulling out a phone to search. "Holy, she is a Navy SEAL pilot." Another guest, louder now. She was awarded the Navy Cross. The murmurs grew louder, overlapping, building into a wave of realization that crashed over the crowd in slow motion. Phones came out. Screens glowed in the darkness. People frantically typed her name into search engines, pulling up articles, photos, commendations. The evidence was undeniable. The girl they had mocked, the girl they had erased, the girl they had invited as a joke, was a decorated war hero. Elowen reached the entrance to the venue. Bridger, Sloan, Paxton, and Lennox stood blocking the Assise doorway, frozen in place, their faces pale, their expressions caught somewhere between shock and horror. Elowen stopped in front of Bridger. She looked him directly in the eye. "You sent me an invitation," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, devoid of anger or bitterness. It was simply a statement of fact. Bridger stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Yes, we thought." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Elowen held his gaze for one more moment. Then she said, quietly, "I am here." She walked past them. They did not move. They could not. Their bodies had forgotten how. Inside the ballroom, the slideshow was still playing. Elowen's old yearbook photo appeared on the massive screen. The same pale face, the same oversized glasses, the same quiet stare. Elowen stopped in the center of the room and looked up at it. Every single person in the ballroom turned to stare at her. The contrast was staggering. The girl on the screen looked like a ghost. The woman standing before them looked like a force of nature. Someone whispered, "That is her?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because the answer was too overwhelming to process. Sloane's phone was still recording. Her hand trembled so badly the footage would be unusable. She did not stop filming. The crowd waited. No one knew what would happen next. No one knew what to say. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally, movement came from an unexpected direction. An older man in a Navy dress uniform stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He was in his mid-50s, his chest covered in medals, his bearing unmistakably military. His name was Captain Dorian Graves, and he walked with the kind of authority that made people step aside without thinking. He approached Elowen, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire ballroom. "Lieutenant Commander Ashby." Elowen turned, and for the first time since stepping off the helicopter, surprise flickered across her face. "Captain Graves?" He smiled, warm and genuine. "I was in the area for a conference. Heard you might be here tonight. Thought I would pay my respects." He extended his hand. She shook it. The crowd watched, utterly confused, unable to piece together what they were witnessing. Captain Graves turned to address the room, his voice louder now, commanding attention. "For those of you who do not know," he said, "Lieutenant Commander Elowen Ashby is a naval aviator and a decorated SEAL support pilot. She flew rescue operations in some of the most hostile environments on the planet." The room was silent. 2 years ago, Captain Graves continued, she led the extraction of 12 Marines under enemy fire in Yemen. She stayed in the air for 6 hours straight, under sustained attack, to bring them home. Every single one of them survived. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. She was awarded the Navy Cross for valor. The silence was absolute. Not a single person moved. Not a single person breathed. The weight of what they had just heard pressed down on the room like a physical force. The girl they had mocked. The girl they had erased. The girl they had invited as a joke. She was a hero. Captain Graves stepped back. He straightened, and then, with deliberate ceremony, he saluted her. Elowen, visibly moved, returned the salute. One by one, 3 other veterans in the crowd stepped forward. They saluted her as well. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was unmistakable. Respect, recognition, gratitude. The slideshow changed. A new image appeared on the screen. It was a recent photo of Elowen in full combat gear, standing beside her Apache helicopter, surrounded by her crew. They were all smiling, arms around each other, mud on their boots, exhaustion and pride in their eyes. The contrast between the two images, between who she had been and who she had become, was undeniable. Someone in the crowd began to cry. If you have ever known someone who was underestimated, someone who was written off, someone who proved the world wrong, share their story in the comments below. And if this moved you, if you believe in the power of quiet strength and dignity, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. The salute hung in the air like a held breath. Captain Graves stood perfectly still, his hand raised to his brow, his posture rigid with military precision. Elowen returned the gesture with equal formality, her movements sharp and practiced, the kind that came from years of repetition until they became instinct. The two of them stood there in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 200 people who suddenly felt like intruders in a moment that did not belong to them. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the projector still cycling through images on the screen behind them. When Captain Graves lowered his hand, 3 other figures stepped forward from different parts of the crowd. They were scattered, but they moved with the same purpose, the same recognition. 2 men and 1 woman, all older, all wearing pieces of their past service, even if they were not in full uniform. One had a navy ball cap tucked under his arm. Another wore a lapel pin shaped like an anchor. The third had a tattoo visible on her forearm, an eagle clutching a trident. They formed a loose line in front of Elowen, and without a word, they saluted her as well. Elowen's jaw tightened. She held their gazes, one by one, and returned each salute with the same measured respect. It was not a performance. It was not for the crowd. It was a private acknowledgement between people who understood things the rest of the room could not. When the last salute was returned, the veterans stepped back, melting into the crowd, but their presence lingered like an echo. The slideshow on the screen changed again. The image that appeared was recent, sharp and vivid in a way the old yearbook photos were not. Elowen stood in full combat gear beside an Apache helicopter, dirt smudged across her cheek, her helmet tucked under one arm. Around her, her crew stood in similar states of exhaustion and relief. Their faces were streaked with dust and sweat, their eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but they were smiling. One of them had his arm slung over Elowen's shoulder. Another was crouched in front, giving an exaggerated thumbs up to the camera. The helicopter behind them was battered, scorch marks visible along the fuselage, a reminder that the machine had been through something brutal and survived. The contrast between the two images, between the fragile girl in the yearbook and the warrior in the photograph, was staggering. It was not just a transformation, it was a reinvention so complete that it felt impossible. And yet, here she stood, living proof. A woman near the back of the room began to cry. Her hand covered her mouth, but the sound escaped anyway, a quiet sob that she tried to stifle. Another guest wiped at his eyes, turning his face away as if embarrassed by the emotion. Someone else simply stared, unblinking, as if trying to reconcile the two versions of the same person and failing. Sloane stood frozen near the edge of the dance floor, her phone still recording. The screen trembled in her grip, the footage shaking so badly it was useless, but she did not stop. She could not. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes locked on Elowen. For the first time in years, Sloane had no idea what to say. No caption came to mind, no witty remark, no curated response. She simply stood there, watching the woman she had once mocked stand in the center of a room full of people who now saw her as untouchable. Paxton stood beside Lennox near the bar, his whiskey forgotten on the counter behind him. His expression was unreadable, a lawyer's mask that hid whatever he was feeling beneath layers of professional detachment. But his hands betrayed him. They gripped the edge of the bar so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Lennox had stopped checking his watch. He stared at Elowen with something that looked almost like fear, as if he had just realized that the joke they had planned, the humiliation they had orchestrated, had backfired in a way that could not be undone. Bridger had not moved from the doorway. He stood with his back against the frame, his arms hanging limply at his sides, his face slack with shock. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground open up beneath him and was waiting for the fall. Elowen turned away from Captain Graves and began to walk. She moved through the center of the ballroom with the same calm, deliberate pace she had used outside. The crowd parted again, not because she demanded it, but because her presence made it inevitable. People stepped back, creating a wide corridor for her to pass through, their eyes following her every movement. Some looked at her with awe, others with shame, a few with something closer to fear. As she walked, whispers spread through the room like wildfire. "Did you hear what he said? Yemen. 6 hours under fire. She saved 12 people. The Navy Cross. Do you know how rare that is? I cannot believe the sentence trailed off, unfinished, because there was no way to finish it that did not sound monstrous. A man in his early 30s, standing near one of the round tables, leaned toward his wife and whispered, "I used to sit behind her in history class. I never said a word to her, not once." His wife looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe you should have," she said quietly. Another guest, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a dress that probably cost more than Elowen's entire wardrobe in high school, turned to her friend and said, "I threw a drink on her once, at a party junior year." Everyone laughed. Her friend stared at her, horrified. "Why would you do that?" the friend asked. The woman did not answer. She just looked down at her hands. Elowen reached the far side of the ballroom, where a set of glass doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the estate's gardens. She paused there, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, and turned back to face the room. The entire crowd was watching her. 200 people, frozen in place, waiting to see what she would do next. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence alone was louder than any words could have been. Then, from the center of the room, a voice broke the silence. It was not loud, but it carried. "Wait." Paxton had stepped forward. He moved with the careful precision of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his grasp. He straightened his tie, forced a smile onto his face, and approached Elowen with his hands slightly raised, palms out, as if trying to calm a volatile situation. "Elowen," he said, his voice smooth and measured, "this is incredible. Truly. We had no idea. We just thought," he paused, searching for the right words, "we thought it would be nice to see you again. To catch up." Elowen looked at him. Her expression did not change. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply waited. Paxton faltered. The smile on his face wavered, threatening to collapse. He glanced back at Bridger and Lennox as if hoping for backup, but neither of them moved. Sloane had lowered her phone, her face pale and blank. They were all paralyzed. Elowen spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You thought it would be nice," she repeated, as if testing the words. She let them hang in the air for a moment. Then she continued. "You invited me here as a joke." The room went silent again. If there had been any lingering noise, any residual conversation or movement, it vanished in an instant. The weight of her words pressed down on the space like a physical force. Paxton opened his mouth to respond, but Elowen cut him off. "I got the email thread," she said. "Someone forwarded it to me." Sloane's breath caught audibly. Bridger closed his eyes. Lennox took a step back, as if distance could somehow erase what had just been said. Elowen continued, her voice still calm, still measured. "I read every word, the jokes about what I would wear, the bets about whether I would show up. The plan to welcome me in front of everyone so you could all feel better about yourselves." Paxton's face had gone from confident to ashen. He stammered, trying to form a response, but nothing coherent came out. Elowen did not wait for him to recover. "I came anyway," she said, "not because I needed your approval, not because I wanted to prove anything to you. I came because I wanted to see if any of you had changed." She looked around the room, her gaze sweeping across the faces of people who had once been her classmates, her peers, the people who had shared 4 years of her life and had spent most of that time pretending she did not exist. Some of them looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others stared back, transfixed, unable to look away. "You have not," Elowen said simply. She turned and pushed open the glass doors, stepping out onto the balcony. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. The doors swung shut behind her, and for a moment, the ballroom was completely still. Then, chaos. The whispers erupted all at once, a cacophony of voices overlapping, competing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Did she just say we invited her as a joke? Oh my God, we did. We actually did. How did she get the email? Who sent it to her? Does it matter? We are horrible. We were horrible. Someone near the bar said, "I cannot believe we thought this was funny." Another voice responded, "I cannot believe I laughed." Sloane stood motionless, staring at the closed glass doors. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her phone and opened the video she had been recording. She watched it for a few seconds, her expression blank, and then she tapped the screen. The video disappeared, deleted. She lowered the phone and stood there, her hands trembling. Bridger finally moved. He pushed himself away from the doorway and walked toward the bar, his movements stiff and mechanical. He poured himself a drink, downed it in one swallow, and poured another. He did not look at anyone. He did not speak. He just drank. Lennox sank into a chair at one of the empty tables, his head in his hands. Paxton stood alone in the center of the ballroom, still frozen in the spot where Elowen had left him, as if moving would require acknowledging what had just happened. Outside on the balcony, Elowen stood at the railing, looking out over the gardens. The helicopter was still visible on the lawn below, its rotors now completely still, the crew standing nearby in quiet conversation. The night was calm, the stars visible above the glow of the estate's lights. She took a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs, letting the silence settle around her. Footsteps approached from behind. Elowen did not turn. She knew someone would come eventually. A woman's voice, hesitant and shaking, broke the silence. "Elowen?" Elowen turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman she vaguely remembered. Maren Kovar. They had shared a few classes but had never spoken. Maren had been part of the crowd, not one of the ringleaders, but not someone who had ever stood up either. She stood there now, tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I am sorry," Maren said, her voice breaking. "I never stood up for you. I saw what they did, and I did nothing. I was scared. I was a coward. But you deserve so much better." Elowen studied her for a long moment. Maren did not look away. She stood there, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for judgment or forgiveness or anything at all. Elowen nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Maren hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but then she simply nodded and turned to leave. She paused in the doorway, looking back one last time. "You are incredible," she said. Then she walked back into the ballroom, leaving Elowen alone again. Elowen turned back to the railing. She stood there for another moment, letting the night settle around her. Then she straightened, her decision made, and walked back toward the doors. Inside the ballroom, the crowd had begun to disperse. Some guests were leaving, calling for their cars, unwilling or unable to stay any longer. Others lingered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their earlier laughter and celebration replaced by something quieter, heavier. The slideshow had stopped. The screen was dark. The jazz band had packed up and left, without anyone noticing. Elowen walked through the room one last time. People stepped aside again, but this time it felt different. There was no awe, no spectacle, just quiet acknowledgement. A man she did not recognize nodded to her as she passed. A woman touched her hand briefly, a gesture of apology or respect or both. Elowen did not stop. She simply walked, her pace steady, her expression calm. Captain Graves stood near the entrance, waiting. When Elowen reached him, he extended his hand again. "It was an honor, Commander," he said. Elowen shook his hand. "The honor was mine, sir." He smiled. "Take care of yourself." "I will." She walked past him, through the entrance, and out onto the front steps of the estate. The valet had already brought the helicopter crew's vehicle around, but Elowen waved it off. She walked across the driveway, down the red carpet, and onto the lawn where the Apache still waited. The crew saw her coming and straightened. The petty officer who had saluted her earlier stepped forward. "Ready when you are, ma'am." Elowen climbed into the helicopter. The crew followed, securing the doors, checking instruments, preparing for departure. The rotors began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, the sound building into the familiar roar that had shaken the estate just an hour before. Inside the ballroom, the remaining guests heard the sound and moved to the windows. They watched as the helicopter lifted off, rising smoothly into the night sky. The landing lights blinked in a steady rhythm, growing smaller and smaller as the aircraft gained altitude. Sloane stood at one of the windows, her reflection faint in the glass. She watched the helicopter until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the darkness. Then she turned away, her shoulders slumped, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Bridger stood at the bar, staring into his empty glass. He set it down carefully, as if afraid it might shatter, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. Paxton sat alone at one of the tables, his head bowed, his hands folded in front of him. He did not move for a long time. Lennox had already left. No one had seen him go. The ballroom emptied slowly, the guests trickling out in ones and twos, leaving behind half-finished drinks and abandoned centerpieces. The staff began to clean up, moving quietly through the space, clearing tables, folding chairs, turning off lights. Within an hour, the room was empty, silent, as if the night had never happened at all. But it had. Outside, on the lawn, the grass was torn up where the helicopter had landed, deep grooves carved into the earth by the weight of the machine. The marks would remain for weeks, a visible reminder that something extraordinary had happened here, something that could not be erased or ignored or laughed away. High above, the Apache continued its flight, cutting through the night sky with precision and purpose. Inside the cockpit, Elowen sat at the controls, her hands steady, her focus absolute. The city lights spread out below her, a glittering sprawl of roads and buildings and lives being lived. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing anymore. The petty officer's voice crackled through the headset. "Course set for base, ma'am." "ETA 30 minutes. Elowen acknowledged with a brief nod. "Copy that." The helicopter banked slightly, adjusting its trajectory, and continued on. The night was clear, the stars bright, the horizon endless. Elowen flew with the kind of ease that came from thousands of hours in the air, from missions flown in conditions most people could not imagine, from a life built on discipline and sacrifice, and an unshakable refusal to let anyone define her worth. She had gone to the reunion not for revenge, not for validation, but for closure, and she had found it. Not in their apologies, not in their shock, but in the simple act of walking away with her dignity intact. The people who had tried to break her had failed, and now, as she flew through the night, surrounded by her crew, heading back to the life she had built, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Peace. The helicopter's navigation lights blinked steadily, red and green against the black sky, a beacon moving through the darkness. Below, the city continued on, unaware of the woman passing overhead, unaware of the story that had just unfolded in a ballroom miles away. But the people in that ballroom would remember. They would carry the memory of this night for the rest of their lives. A quiet, inescapable reminder that the person they underestimated, the person they mocked, the person they tried to erase, had become something far greater than any of them would ever be. And Elowen Ashby, flying through the night, surrounded by the people who had stood beside her in the worst moments of her life, needed nothing more from them. She had already won. Back at the estate, the last of the guests had finally left. The staff finished their work and turned off the remaining lights, leaving the building dark and empty. The red carpet was rolled up. The valet stand was closed. The gardens returned to their quiet stillness. On the projection screen, now black and lifeless, the last image that had been displayed remained burned into the memory of everyone who had seen it. Elowen in her flight suit, surrounded by her crew, smiling. Not the fragile, invisible girl they remembered, but the woman she had become, a warrior, a leader, a legend. The night ended not with celebration, but with silence. And in that silence, a truth settled over everyone who had been there, a truth they would carry with them long after the reunion was forgotten. Some people are underestimated not because they are weak, but because others are too blind to see their strength. And when those people rise, when they prove the world wrong, the only response left is quiet, humbling respect. Have you ever witnessed someone rise above the cruelty they faced? Have you seen someone become more than anyone thought possible? Share your story below. And if you believe in the power of resilience and dignity, consider subscribing. There are more untold stories waiting. The Apache cut through the night with mechanical precision, its rotors slicing the air in steady rhythmic beats that echoed across the empty sky. Inside the cockpit, Elowen sat at the controls, her hands resting lightly on the cyclic and collective, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the city lights bled into darkness. The instruments glowed softly in front of her, displaying altitude, speed, heading, all the data she needed to navigate the sky with the kind of ease that came from years of training and thousands of hours in the air. The petty officer sat beside her, monitoring systems, running through post-flight checks, even though they were still airborne. Behind them, in the crew compartment, the other two members sat in silence, their helmets resting on their laps, their faces shadowed in the dim interior light. The headset crackled with static before the petty officer's voice came through, calm and professional. "Ma'am," he said, "we are getting a request from base. They want confirmation of arrival time." Elowen glanced at the navigation display, her eyes scanning the digital readout with practiced efficiency. 30 minutes, she said, her voice steady. "Tell them we are on schedule. Copy that." The petty officer relayed the information, his words brief and efficient, the kind of communication that left no room for ambiguity or error. When he finished, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the radio controls. Then he spoke again, his tone softer, more personal. "That was something back there, ma'am. What you did." Elowen did not respond immediately. She adjusted the headings slightly, compensating for a crosswind that had picked up as they moved farther from the coast, her movements fluid and automatic. The helicopter responded to her touch like an extension of her own body, banking gently, finding the new course with minimal effort. "I did not do anything," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I just showed up." The petty officer smiled faintly, though she could not see it in the darkness. "Sometimes that is enough," he said. Elowen said nothing more. She kept her eyes forward, watching the darkness ahead, the endless expanse of sky that stretched out in every direction like an ocean without shores. Up here, above the noise and the judgment and the weight of other people's expectations, she felt something close to freedom. The helicopter responded to her slightest touch, moving as an extension of her will, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in the space between the earth and the stars. There was no past here, no future, only the present moment, the hum of the engines, the feel of the controls beneath her hands, the vast darkness surrounding her like a cocoon. Back at the Cascadia Grand Estate, the ballroom was nearly empty now. The last few guests lingered near the exits, their conversations muted and subdued, nothing like the laughter and energy that had filled the space just hours before. The staff moved quietly through the room, collecting glassware, folding tablecloths, dismantling the decorations that had been so carefully arranged. The slideshow screen remained dark, a blank rectangle that loomed over the space like a silent witness to everything that had unfolded. The chandeliers, which had sparkled so brilliantly earlier in the evening, now cast a cold, sterile light over the emptying room. Marin Kovar stood near one of the tall windows, her arms wrapped around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She stared out at the lawn where the helicopter had landed, her reflection ghostly in the glass. The grass was torn up, deep gouges carved into the earth by the weight of the Apache, the marks brutal and unignorable in the ambient light from the estate. She had not left yet, even though most of the other guests had already gone. She stood there, alone, replaying the night in her mind, replaying every moment she had stood by and said nothing, while Elowen had been mocked and erased. Every opportunity she had missed to be something other than complicit. A man approached from behind, his footsteps slow and hesitant on the marble floor. Marin turned, her heart jumping slightly at the interruption. It was one of the veterans who had saluted Elowen earlier, the one with the navy ball cap. He held it in his hands now, turning it over absently, his fingers tracing the embroidered anchor on the front. "You knew her?" he said. It was not quite a question, more of an observation spoken aloud. Maren nodded, her throat tight. "We went to school together." "I never," she paused, searching for the right words, words that could somehow encompass the magnitude of her failure. "I never stood up for her." The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, weathered by years and experiences she could only guess at. Then he said, his voice gentle but firm, "You did tonight." Maren looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. "It was not enough," she whispered. The man shook his head slowly. "Maybe not," he conceded, "but it was something." He placed the cap back on his head and adjusted it carefully, the gesture almost ritualistic. "She did not have to come here tonight," he continued. "She did not owe any of you anything. But she came anyway. That takes a kind of strength most people do not have. Most people would have stayed away, would have let you all continue thinking whatever you wanted to think. But she came, and she looked every one of you in the eye." Maren nodded again, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The weight of his words pressed down on her, heavy and inescapable. The man turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with eyes that had seen too much to judge harshly, but too much to let pass without comment. "If you want to make it right," he said, "do not just apologize. Do better. Be better." That is what she would want. Not your guilt. Your growth. He walked away, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty ballroom, leaving Maren alone at the window. She stood there for a long time, watching the torn-up lawn, letting his words settle over her like a weight she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. The marks in the grass would heal eventually. The groundskeepers would repair the damage. New sod would be laid. But the marks this night had left on her would never fully disappear. In another part of the estate, tucked away in one of the garden alcoves where stone benches sat beneath trellises heavy with climbing roses, Sloane sat with her phone dark and forgotten beside her. She had not posted anything since the helicopter landed. She had not even opened her social media apps, had not checked her notifications, had not crafted a single carefully worded caption. For the first time in years, she had no idea what to say, no way to spin what had happened into something palatable, something shareable, something that would fit into the carefully curated narrative of her life. The carefully constructed version of herself that she presented to the world felt hollow now, exposed as a fiction built on cruelty and shallow validation. Every post, every photo, every perfectly filtered moment suddenly seemed like evidence of a life lived entirely on the surface, a life where depth was measured in likes and engagement rather than substance or character. She thought about the email thread. She had been the one to suggest adding Elowen to the guest list. She could see it clearly in her memory the moment the idea had occurred to her, the spark of malicious inspiration. She had laughed the hardest when Bridger typed Elowen's name into the guest list. She had been the one to say with such casual certainty, people like Elowen always show up hoping things have changed. And she had been right. Elowen had shown up, but not in the way Sloane had imagined, not even close. Sloane picked up her phone, the screen lighting up at her touch, casting a pale glow across her face. She opened her photo gallery and scrolled back through years of images, past the perfectly lit selfies taken at golden hour, past the stage brunch photos and the vacation snapshots and the endless documentation of a life designed to look effortless and enviable. She kept scrolling, going back further and further, until she reached a folder she had not opened in years. High school photos. She hesitated for a moment, then tapped it. The images loaded slowly, memories from another lifetime. Group shots at parties she barely remembered. Prom pictures with dates whose names she had forgotten. Candid moments frozen in time, preserved in digital amber. She scrolled through them mechanically until one image made her stop. It was taken during a class trip, somewhere unremarkable, probably a museum or historical site that had seemed boring at the time. The photo was meant to capture the group of friends in the foreground, all smiling and making faces at the camera. But in the background, barely visible and slightly out of focus, was Elowen. She was sitting alone on a bench, her posture hunched as if she were trying to disappear, to fold in on herself, and take up as little space as possible. A book was open in her lap, and her head was bent over it, her face hidden behind a curtain of thin hair. Even in the blurred background of someone else's photo, even reduced to an afterthought in someone else's moment, her isolation was palpable. Sloane stared at the image, her chest tightening with something that felt like shame but went deeper, touched something more fundamental. She had been there that day. She had been in the foreground of that photo, smiling and carefree. She had seen Elowen sitting alone on that bench, and she had done nothing. Worse than nothing. She had probably made a joke about it, had probably pointed it out to her friends so they could all feel superior together. She closed the app and set the phone down on the bench beside her, face down, as if hiding the screen could somehow undo what she had seen. For a long time, she just sat there in the garden, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees, feeling the weight of her own complicity settle over her like a shroud. The night air smelled of jasmine and earth, sweet and clean, but it could not wash away the bitter taste in her mouth. Bridger had left the estate without saying goodbye to anyone, without acknowledging the few remaining guests or thanking the staff or doing any of the things a host was supposed to do. He had simply walked to his car, climbed in, and driven away, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. The city lights blurred past the windows, indistinct and meaningless, just streaks of color in the darkness. He replayed the moment when Elowen had looked at him, her gaze calm and steady and utterly without malice, and said, "You sent me an invitation." The words echoed in his mind, relentless and accusatory, refusing to be silenced or rationalized away. He had sent the invitation. He had thought it was funny. He had been so certain, so absolutely convinced, that Elowen would show up diminished, embarrassed, a living reminder of how far he and the others had come, proof of their success measured against her failure. He pulled into the parking garage of his building, the tires squealing slightly on the smooth concrete, and sat in the car for a long time after turning off the engine. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant hum of the city outside. He thought about the Navy Cross. He thought about Yemen. He thought about 6 hours under fire. He tried to imagine what that meant, what it took, the kind of courage and skill and determination required to do something like that. And he could not. The gap between his life and hers was so vast it felt unbridgeable, like trying to compare two different species rather than two people who had walked the same hallways and sat in the same classrooms. What had he done with his life? Sold houses, closed deals, made money, built a portfolio of properties and investments that looked impressive on paper, but felt increasingly hollow when measured against what Elowen had accomplished. He had spent 10 years accumulating wealth and status, and she had spent 10 years saving lives. He climbed out of the car and walked to the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the empty garage, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached his apartment, he poured himself a drink, the expensive whiskey he kept for special occasions, and stood at the window looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Elowen was flying back to a life he would never understand, a life built on sacrifice and discipline and something far beyond the hollow success he had accumulated. He raised the glass to his lips, then stopped. The amber liquid caught the light, beautiful and meaningless. He set it down on the windowsill, untouched, and walked away. He did not want to drink away what he was feeling. He did not want to numb it or forget it. He wanted to feel it, every bit of it, because maybe that was the beginning of something. Maybe that was the first step toward becoming something other than what he was. Paxton had stayed at the estate longer than anyone else, long after the last guests had trickled out, long after the staff had finished most of their cleanup and begun casting pointed glances in his direction. He sat alone at one of the empty tables, his hands folded in front of him like a penitent in church, staring at the dark projection screen. He was a lawyer. He was trained to argue, to dissect, to find the angle that would shift perception in his favor. He made his living finding ways to defend the indefensible, to present alternate narratives, to create reasonable doubt where none should exist. But there was no angle here, no argument, no defense. What they had done was indefensible, and Elowen had laid it bare with a handful of calm, measured words that had cut through every possible rationalization like a knife through paper. He thought about the email thread. He had been copied on it. He had read every message as they came in, had watched the conversation unfold in real time. He had laughed at Bridger's jokes. He had added his own comments. And when Bridger had added Elowen's name to the guest list, Paxton had said nothing to stop it. He had not objected. He had not suggested maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe they were going too far. He had been complicit, not just passively, but actively. He had participated in the cruelty, even if he had not been the one to initiate it. A member of the staff approached, a young woman in a crisp uniform, who looked exhausted and ready to go home. "Sir," she said politely but firmly, "we are closing up for the night." Paxton nodded and stood, his movements slow and heavy. He walked out of the ballroom, through the entrance with its marble columns and elegant architecture, and onto the front steps. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of jasmine and earth and the faint smell of cut grass from the torn-up lawn. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the lawn where the helicopter had landed, the marks in the grass still visible in the landscape lighting, dark and jagged against the manicured green. He had spent his entire career defending people, arguing their cases, finding ways to make the indefensible seem reasonable, or at least understandable. He was good at it, very good. He had built a successful practice on his ability to find those angles, to construct those narratives. But standing there, looking at the torn-up earth where an Apache helicopter had landed to deliver a woman they had tried to humiliate, he realized there was no defense for what he had done, no argument that could make it right, no narrative that could reframe it into something acceptable. He turned and walked to his car, the weight of that realization pressing down on him with every step, settling into his bones like a chronic ache he knew would never fully go away. Lennox had left immediately after Elowen, walked out onto the balcony, had not waited to see what would happen next, had not lingered to process or discuss or commiserate with the others. He had simply left, moving through the crowd like a ghost, finding his car, and driving back to his apartment in silence, his mind racing faster than his Tesla on the empty highway. He prided himself on being strategic, on seeing opportunities others missed, on staying 3 steps ahead of everyone else. It was how he had built his startup, how he had secured funding, how he had grown his company from an idea into something real and valuable. He was good at reading people, at understanding what they wanted, at positioning himself to take advantage of situations before others even recognized they existed. But tonight, he had miscalculated so catastrophically that it felt like a failure, not just of judgment, but of character, of the fundamental understanding of human nature he thought he possessed. He sat at his desk in his minimalist apartment, his laptop open in front of him, and typed Elowen's name into a search engine. The results flooded the screen immediately. Articles, photos, commendations, a profile in a military magazine with a striking photo of her standing beside her helicopter, a news story about the Yemen extraction with quotes from the Marines she had saved, a Department of Defense press release announcing her Navy Cross Award. He read through them methodically, one by one, piecing together the life she had built after leaving Glenridge Academy. Every article reinforced what he already knew, what had been made brutally clear in that ballroom. She had become extraordinary. She had taken the pain and isolation of her high school years and transformed it into something remarkable. And he had tried to humiliate her. He had participated in a plan to mock her, to remind her of her lowest moment, to make her feel small again. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his expensive apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its carefully selected modern furniture. For the first time in years, possibly for the first time in his adult life, he felt something he had almost forgotten, something his success had insulated him from: shame. Deep, gnawing shame that could not be rationalized away or reframed or spun into a learning experience. Just shame, pure and simple and inescapable. High above the city, the Apache continued its flight through the darkness. The lights of the urban sprawl gave way to darker terrain, forests and hills and open fields that stretched out beneath them like a patchwork quilt, stitched together with roads and rivers. Elowen adjusted the collective slightly, maintaining altitude with micro movements of her hand, her actions automatic and fluid, the product of so many hours in the cockpit that flying had become as natural as breathing. The petty officer beside her had gone quiet, lost in his own thoughts, and the silence in the cockpit was comfortable, the kind that came from mutual respect and shared experience. They did not need to fill the space with conversation. The quiet was enough. Elowen thought about the reunion, letting the memories flow through her mind without judgment or emotion. She thought about the faces in the crowd, the shock and the shame, and the quiet realization that had spread through the room like a wave. She thought about Bridger's stammering attempt to explain, about Sloane's trembling hands, about Paxton's hollow smile crumbling. She had not gone there seeking revenge. She had not wanted to make them suffer. She had simply wanted to see if they had changed, if the years had softened the cruelty that had defined her high school experience. If any of them had grown beyond the people they had been when they were 17 and 18 and thought they owned the world. They had not changed, at least not until tonight. Not until they had been forced to confront the reality of who she had become and what their cruelty had failed to do to her. But that was not her burden to carry anymore. She had done what she came to do. She had shown up. She had stood in that room, surrounded by people who had once tried to break her, and she had shown them exactly who she had become, not for their approval, not for their validation, but for herself, to prove, once and for all, that their cruelty had not defined her, had not limited her, had not succeeded in making her believe she was what they said she was. The headset crackled again, pulling her from her thoughts. "Ma'am," the petty officer said, "we are 10 minutes out." Elowen acknowledged with a brief nod, her focus shifting back to the immediate task. "Copy that. Prepare for landing." The crew began their pre-landing checks, running through the procedures with practiced efficiency, each member knowing their role and executing it flawlessly. Elowen adjusted the heading, lining up the approach, her focus narrowing to the task at hand until everything else fell away. The base appeared on the horizon, a cluster of lights against the darkness, familiar and welcoming in a way that no other place had ever been. This was home, not a building or a city, but this life, this purpose, these people who understood what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. She guided the helicopter down, the descent smooth and controlled, the rotors adjusting to the changing air pressure with a subtle shift in pitch. The landing pad came into view, marked by bright white lights arranged in a perfect square, and Elowen brought the Apache down with precision, touching the skids to the ground so gently it barely registered as a landing at all, just a subtle shift from flight to stillness. The rotors began to slow, the roar diminishing to a steady hum, then fading to silence. Elowen went through the shutdown procedure methodically, flipping switches, checking gauges, ensuring everything was secure and properly logged. When she finished, she removed her helmet and set it on the seat beside her, running a hand through her hair to loosen the tight bun that had held it in place. The petty officer did the same, then turned to her with a tired smile that creased the corners of his eyes. "Good flight, ma'am," he said. Elowen returned the smile, genuine and warm. "Good crew," she replied, because it was true. A pilot was only as good as the people around her, and she had the best. They climbed out of the helicopter, their boots hitting the tarmac with solid thuds that echoed in the quiet night. The other two crew members followed, stretching and yawning, the exhaustion of the long night finally catching up with them now that the mission was complete and the adrenaline was fading. A ground crew member approached with a clipboard, ready to begin the post-flight inspection, and Elowen signed off on the paperwork, exchanged a few brief words with the crew chief about a minor hydraulic issue that needed attention, and then walked toward the barracks. The base was quiet at this hour, most of the personnel either asleep or off duty. The night air was cool and still, carrying the scent of jet fuel and cut grass, and something indefinable that was just the smell of military bases everywhere. The stars were bright overhead, undimmed by the modest lighting of the base, spread across the sky in a magnificent display that never got old, no matter how many times she saw it. Elowen walked slowly, in no hurry to reach her quarters, letting the events of the night settle in her mind like sediment in water. She thought about Marin's apology, the raw sincerity in her voice, the tears streaming down her face. She thought about Captain Graves' salute, the weight of that gesture, the respect it represented. She thought about the look on Bridger's face when she had told him she knew about the email thread, the way his expression had crumbled, all his confidence and smugness evaporating in an instant. She thought about the girl she had been 10 years ago, sitting alone in the cafeteria with her engineering textbook, reading about flight dynamics and dreaming of a life beyond the cruelty of high school. That girl had been invisible to everyone around her, written off as nothing, dismissed as a dreamer with no future, someone to be mocked and ignored in equal measure. But that girl had also been determined. She had refused to let their cruelty define her, or limit her, or convince her that their assessment of her worth was accurate. She had taken every ounce of pain and doubt and loneliness and turned it into fuel, into drive, into an unshakable refusal to give up or give in or accept the limitations others tried to place on her. She had walked into that Navy recruitment booth at career day while everyone else laughed, and she had asked questions, and she had listened, and she had started down a path that would transform her completely. And now, that girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had flown rescue missions in hostile territory, who had saved lives under fire, who had earned the respect of her peers and the recognition of her superiors, who wore the uniform of the United States Navy and had been awarded the Navy Cross for valor. The transformation was not magic. It was not luck. It was the result of years of relentless effort, of pushing through doubt and fear and exhaustion, of refusing to accept the limits others tried to place on her, of waking up every single day and choosing to be better than she had been the day before. Elowen reached her quarters and paused outside the door, her hand resting on the handle. She looked up at the stars one more time, the same stars she had looked at as a teenager lying in bed in her childhood home. The same stars that had represented possibility and escape, and a future beyond the walls of Glenridge Academy. Back then, the stars had felt impossibly far away, as distant and unreachable as the life she dreamed of living. Now she flew among them. She lived the dream that girl had held onto when there was nothing else to hold onto. She opened the door and stepped inside, closing it quietly behind her. The room was small and functional, containing only the essentials. A bed with military corners, crisp and neat. A desk with a lamp and a few technical manuals. A locker for her uniforms and personal items. There were no decorations, no personal touches, no photos on the walls or trinkets on the desk. Just the essentials. Everything she needed and nothing she did not. Elowen sat on the edge of the bed and removed her boots, unlacing them carefully and setting them neatly beside the door, aligned perfectly with each other out of habit. She unzipped her flight suit and hung it carefully in the locker, her movements methodical and precise. Then she sat back down on the bed, in her undershirt and pants, and stared at the wall, letting the silence fill the space around her like water filling a pool. She thought about the reunion one last time, allowing herself to process it fully now that she was alone and safe. She thought about the 4 people who had orchestrated the joke, who had invited her as a final act of humiliation, expecting her to arrive diminished and embarrassed. They had expected her to show up alone, uncomfortable in borrowed clothes, out of place and painfully aware of it, a living embodiment of failure that would make their own success feel even sweeter by comparison. Instead, she had arrived in an Apache helicopter, descending from the sky like something out of a movie, surrounded by her crew, wearing the uniform of someone who had dedicated her life to something greater than herself. The look on their faces had been worth every second of the long flight. Not because she wanted them to suffer, though she was human enough to admit there was some satisfaction in seeing their shock, but because their reaction was proof that she had won, proof that their cruelty had failed, proof that the person they had tried to break had become something they could never touch, something they could never diminish, something that existed entirely outside the sphere of their judgment or approval. Elowen lay back on the bed, not bothering to pull back the covers, and stared at the ceiling. The paint was institutional white, plain and unmarked, but she did not really see it. She was seeing the ballroom, the faces in the crowd, the torn-up lawn where the helicopter had landed. She felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from completing a mission, from doing what needed to be done, from facing something difficult and coming out the other side intact. She closed her eyes and let herself drift, the events of the night replaying in her mind like a film, each scene vivid and clear. The rooftop bar where they had planned her humiliation. The ballroom filled with laughter that had died the moment the helicopter descended. The silence when she had walked through the crowd. Captain Graves stepping forward to salute her. Marin's tearful apology. Paxton's attempted defense crumbling under the weight of truth. The look on Bridger's face when she had told him she knew. Somewhere, far away, in a city she would never return to, 4 people sat alone in the darkness, confronting the weight of their own choices. Bridger stood at his window, staring out at nothing, his expensive whiskey untouched. Sloane sat in the garden, her phone dark and forgotten, her carefully curated life revealed as the hollow construction it was. Paxton drove through empty streets, replaying Elowen's words over and over, his legal mind unable to construct any defense for what he had done. Lennox sat at his desk, surrounded by articles about a woman he had once dismissed, realizing too late the magnitude of his mistake and the poverty of his own character. They would carry this night with them for the rest of their lives. Not as a memory of a reunion, not as a funny story to tell at parties, but as a reckoning. A moment when the person they had underestimated proved them wrong in the most undeniable way possible. A moment when they were forced to confront who they really were and what they had become, and the reflection they saw was ugly. And Elowen, lying in her quarters on a military base hundreds of miles away, felt nothing toward them. Not anger, which would have given them too much power. Not satisfaction, which would have meant she still cared what they thought. Not even pity, which would have suggested they deserved her emotional energy. Just indifference. They had lost their power over her years ago, the moment she had decided their assessment of her worth was meaningless. Tonight had simply been the final confirmation. The closing of a chapter that had been finished long before she walked into that ballroom. The next morning, Elowen woke early, as she always did, her internal clock set by years of military routine. The first light of dawn was just beginning to seep through. The small window, painting the walls with soft gray light. She dressed in her uniform, the movements automatic, practiced over thousands of mornings until they required no thought. Laced up her boots with the same care she always took, ensuring they were secure and properly tied. Made her bed with hospital corners, the blanket pulled tight enough to bounce a coin on. She headed to the mess hall for breakfast, walking through the quiet base as it came to life around her. Other personnel were beginning their days, moving through their routines with the same practiced efficiency. Greetings were exchanged, brief and professional. A nod here, a good morning there. The familiar rhythm of military life unfolding with clockwork precision. She sat alone at a table near the window, a position she had always preferred, eating quietly and watching the sun rise over the distant hills. The sky transformed from gray to pink to gold, the light spreading across the landscape like paint across canvas. It was beautiful in a way that never got old, a daily reminder that the world was bigger than any one person's problems or triumphs. A fellow pilot approached, a woman named Lieutenant Hayes, who Elowen had flown with on several occasions. She carried a tray of food and gestured to the empty seat across from Elowen with a questioning look. "Mind if I join you?" Elowen nodded, swallowing her mouthful of eggs. "Go ahead." Hayes sat down and began eating, making small talk about the weather, about an upcoming training exercise that promised to be challenging, about nothing in particular. The conversation was easy and comfortable, the kind that came from mutual respect and shared experience. Then Hayes paused, setting down her fork, and looked at Elowen with a curious expression. "I heard you went to a reunion last night," she said, her tone casual but interested. Elowen glanced up from her breakfast. "Word travels fast," she said with a slight smile. Hayes shrugged, returning the smile. Small base. Everyone knows everyone's business eventually. "So, how was it?" Elowen considered the question, taking a sip of her coffee before responding. "It was exactly what I expected," she said finally. Hayes waited for more, clearly hoping for details or a story. But when Elowen did not elaborate, she shrugged and went back to her food, accepting the boundary without pushing. "Fair enough," she said. They ate in comfortable silence after that, the kind that came from mutual respect and an understanding that some things did not need to be explained or shared. When they finished, they cleared their trays together and headed out, walking toward the flight line where the day's training was about to begin. The Apache sat waiting on the tarmac, gleaming in the morning light, ready for whatever mission came next. Elowen climbed into the cockpit and began her pre-flight checks, running through the procedures with the same meticulous attention she brought to every flight. The controls responded to her. Touch, familiar and reliable, like shaking hands with an old friend. She went through each item on the checklist, her mind focused, her purpose clear. This was where she belonged, not in a ballroom full of people who had never understood her and never would. Not in a world defined by shallow validation and hollow success measured in likes and followers and expensive cars. But here, in the cockpit of a machine built for precision and purpose, surrounded by people who valued competence and courage above all else. Here, where performance mattered more than popularity, where skill trumped social status, where what you could do was infinitely more important than who you knew, or where you came from, or what people thought of you. The rotors began to spin, the sound building from a whisper to a roar as the engines came to life. Elowen lifted off smoothly, the ground falling away beneath her as the helicopter rose, the base shrinking below. She banked the aircraft and headed toward the training range, the familiar landmarks passing beneath her, the world spreading out in every direction. Up here, above the noise and the judgment and the weight of other people's expectations, she was free. Free to be exactly who she was without explanation or apology. Free to define her own worth based on her own standards rather than someone else's narrow definitions. Free to live a life built on her own terms, shaped by her own choices, measured by her own metrics of success. And as the helicopter cut through the morning sky, sunlight glinting off the canopy, Elowen allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She had gone to the reunion not for revenge, which would have been petty, not for validation, which would have meant she still needed their approval, but for closure. And she had found it. Not in their apologies or their shock or their belated recognition of her worth, but in the simple act of showing up, of standing in that room with her head held high, of looking them in the eye and letting them see exactly who she had become, and then walking away. She had won. Not because she had humiliated them, though that had been an inevitable consequence of the truth, but because she had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that their cruelty had not broken her. It had not limited her. It had not succeeded in making her small or convincing her she was less than she was. If anything, it had forged her, tempered her like steel and fire, burning away weakness and doubt and leaving behind something stronger than they could ever imagine. The people who had tried to erase her would carry the memory of that night for the rest of their lives, a permanent reminder of their own cruelty and its spectacular failure. But Elowen would not carry it. She had already moved on, already left it behind like everything else from that part of her life. She had a mission to complete, a crew to lead, a life to live that was full of purpose and meaning and challenges that actually mattered. And none of it involved looking back at people who had never seen her clearly in the first place. The helicopter disappeared into the distance, becoming a small speck against the vast blue sky, carrying with it a woman who had become a legend not because she sought recognition or fame, but because she had refused to let anyone else define her worth or limit her potential, or convince her that their assessment of who she was mattered more than her own knowledge of what she could become. And somewhere, in a city far behind her, growing smaller with every passing mile, the torn-up lawn of the Cascadia Grand Estate remained. The marks in the grass were deep and unmistakable, carved into the earth by the weight of an Apache helicopter that had descended like a thunderbolt. The groundskeepers would repair it eventually, would lay new sod and water it carefully until the scars disappeared. But for now, the marks remained, a silent reminder visible to anyone who passed by. A reminder that some people rise above the cruelty they face, transform it into strength, and become something extraordinary. And when they do, when they return not with bitterness or revenge, but with quiet dignity and undeniable proof of their worth, the only possible response is humility. The only appropriate reaction is respect. The only honest acknowledgement is the admission that you were wrong, that you misjudged, that you underestimated someone who turned out to be far greater than you ever dreamed of becoming. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the earth, illuminating the torn grass and the empty ballroom and the city beyond. Life continued as it always did, indifferent to individual dramas and personal reckonings. But for the people who had been in that ballroom, who had witnessed what happened when casual cruelty met earned dignity, something had changed. A seed had been planted, a question raised that could not be unasked. If they had been so wrong about Elowen, what else were they wrong about? If the person they had dismissed as nothing had become something remarkable, what did that say about their own judgment, their own character, their own worth? The questions would linger, uncomfortable and persistent, demanding answers that would not come easily. And high above it all, cutting through the clear morning air with purpose and precision, Elowen flew onward toward whatever came next, carrying with her the quiet confidence of someone who had faced her past and found that it had no power over her future. She was free in a way that her former classmates, trapped in their guilt and their belated recognition of their own cruelty, might never be. The helicopter banked slightly, adjusting course, and continued on. Behind it, the base fell away, becoming small and then smaller still until it was just another point on the landscape. Ahead lay the training range, and beyond that, whatever missions and challenges the future held. Elowen was ready for all of it, had been preparing for it her entire adult life, and she faced it with the same calm determination she had brought to everything else. She had proven what she needed to prove, not to them, but to herself, that the scared, lonely girl who had walked out of Glenridge Academy 10 years ago had survived, had thrived, had become someone worthy of respect, not because of where she came from or who had validated her, but because of what she had done, who she had helped, what she had sacrificed in service of something larger than herself. That was the real victory, not the shock on their faces or the shame in their eyes, but the knowledge, deep and unshakable, that she had become exactly who she wanted to be. And no one, not the bullies from her past, or the doubters in her present, or the challenges in her future, could take that away from her. If you have ever known someone who was counted out, written off, dismissed as nothing, and then rose to prove everyone wrong, share their story in the comments below. If you have ever been that person yourself, know that your journey matters, that your transformation is real, that the people who underestimated you do not define your worth. And if you believe in the power of resilience, of quiet determination, of becoming more than anyone thought possible, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, stories of people who refuse to be defined by the cruelty of others and instead define themselves through their actions and their character, waiting to be told. Thank you for being here, for listening, for understanding that sometimes the most powerful victories are the quiet ones, won not through revenge but through simply becoming undeniably, extraordinarily yourself.